Before a single frame was filmed, Dr. Zhivago was already caught in a global storm, one that had nothing to do with cinema. A sweeping love story set against the Russian Revolution, the film became one of the most celebrated epics of the 1960s. Behind its stunning visuals lies a production shaped by political danger, extreme conditions, and secrets kept for decades. What most viewers never knew is that its journey to the screen began not in a director's office, but in the corridors of power, and some of those involved weren't filmmakers at all. Number 1. The CIA weaponized the novel. The Cold War was fought on many fronts, and one of the most unexpected was literature. In the late 1950s, the CIA identified Boris Pasternak's novel as a powerful ideological weapon. The book painted Soviet life with complexity and humanity, directly challenging the official narrative the Kremlin worked hard to maintain. Western intelligence saw an opportunity too significant to ignore. Working through back channels, the agency secretly arranged for the novel to be printed in small quantities and distributed inside the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. The operation was carefully concealed. Copies were smuggled in through cultural events and international book fairs, passed hand to hand in secret. The goal was straightforward: let ordinary Soviet citizens read a story their own government had banned. The impact was lasting. The novel's underground circulation made it a symbol of resistance long before it reached any cinema screen. When MGM eventually turned it into a film, that political charge didn't disappear. It added a layer of global significance that few Hollywood productions had ever carried. This was never just a love story. From its very first pages, it was a battlefield. Number 2. A Nobel Prize turned dangerous. Few moments in literary history carried as much personal risk as one that should have been a pure celebration. In 1958, Boris Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, a recognition that would have been a triumph under any other circumstances. Instead, it triggered a wave of state-sponsored pressure that would define the final years of his life. The Soviet government viewed the award as a political provocation. Pasternak was publicly condemned, expelled from the Soviet Writers' Union, and subjected to relentless intimidation. Colleagues were pressured to denounce him. The campaign was so intense that he felt compelled to decline the prize, a deeply painful decision he later expressed regret over in private correspondence. His novel remained banned inside the Soviet Union, and his name became associated with defiance rather than achievement. By the time the film adaptation was in development, Pasternak had already passed away. He died in 1960, never seeing his story reach the worldwide audience it deserved. The controversy surrounding him only deepened international interest in the production, turning what might have been a straightforward adaptation into something far more charged. Number 3. The film rights were a mess. Securing the legal right to adapt the novel turned out to be far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Because the book had been published in Italy first, bypassing Soviet censorship entirely, the question of who actually owned the rights became genuinely unclear. Multiple parties claimed ownership, and the legal situation was tangled enough to put the entire production at serious risk. Italian publisher Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli had released the original edition in 1957 and held firm to his rights. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities refused to recognize the novel's legitimacy at all, creating a strange situation where the book existed in a kind of legal no man's land. Producer Carlo Ponti, initially attached to the project, found himself navigating competing claims before the production eventually moved forward under MGM. The confusion delayed development significantly and forced producers to work carefully around the legal complexities. When director David Lean came on board, the rights situation had only recently been clarified enough to proceed. It was a surprisingly fragile foundation for what would become one of the most expensive and ambitious productions of the decade, a reminder that even great films can come within a signature of never existing at all. Number 4. The role meant for Sophia Loren. Long before cameras rolled, the central female role in this epic was being shaped around one of the biggest stars in the world. Sophia Loren was the original choice to play Lara, a casting decision that would have given the film an entirely different identity. Her husband and producer Carlo Ponti was deeply involved in the early development of the project, making the connection seem entirely natural. But it didn't hold. The reasons for Loren's departure vary depending on the source, but the most widely accepted account points to creative and logistical complications that made the pairing unworkable. Other names were considered during the casting process, including Jane Fonda and Yvette Mimieux, but none felt right to David Lean, who was searching for a very specific combination of vulnerability and quiet strength. The role eventually went to Julie Christie, a relative newcomer who had not yet reached international stardom. The contrast with Loren couldn't have been more striking. Christie brought understated intensity rather than grand glamour. In hindsight, it's difficult to imagine the movie without her. But for a significant stretch of its development, Dr. Zhivago was being built around a completely different vision of its most iconic character. Number 5. Why Russia was never an option. The most logical place to film a story about Russia was, of course, Russia itself. But in the mid-1960s, that option was never seriously on the table. The Soviet Union had banned the source novel, and the prospect of a Western production crew arriving to recreate scenes of revolution and political upheaval on Soviet soil was simply not going to happen. Beyond the political impossibility, deeper practical concerns existed. Even if some form of access had been granted, Soviet authorities would almost certainly have demanded significant creative control, a condition David Lean was not prepared to accept under any circumstances. The director was known for his uncompromising approach to filmmaking, and outside interference was not something he would tolerate regardless of the location. Several countries were considered as alternatives before Spain emerged as the final choice. Finland and Canada were explored for their winter landscapes, while parts of Yugoslavia were also evaluated. Spain ultimately offered the right combination of locations, studio infrastructure, available workforce, and political cooperation. It was a practical solution that would demand enormous creative effort to make convincing. But as the finished film demonstrated, the illusion held beautifully. Number 6. Moscow rebuilt in Spain. Some productions dress existing locations to pass as something else. This one built an entire city from the ground up. Near Madrid, a full-scale recreation of pre-revolutionary Moscow was constructed. Streets, facades, storefronts, and architectural details, all painstakingly designed to match a city the production team could never actually visit. It remains one of the most ambitious set constructions in Hollywood history. Production designer John Box led the effort, working from historical photographs, paintings, and reference materials to recreate Moscow's distinctive look with as much accuracy as possible. Hundreds of workers spent months erecting buildings that would need to withstand not just filming, but the Spanish climate. Tramlines were laid, signs were lettered in Cyrillic. The level of detail extended far beyond what the camera would ever fully capture. The result was a set so convincing that visitors who had never seen Moscow reportedly found it genuinely believable. David Lean used it to stage some of the film's most visually striking sequences, including the protest scenes that would later cause their own unexpected complications. Constructing a foreign capital in a different country on a tight timeline, using a workforce unfamiliar with the source material, it was an extraordinary logistical achievement that rarely gets the recognition it deserves. Number 7. Christie was an unlikely choice. The studio had very different ideas about who should play Lara. When David Lean first expressed interest in Julie Christie, she had appeared in only a handful of productions and had not yet established herself as a major international name. Executives were skeptical. This was a role that would anchor one of the most expensive films MGM had ever greenlit, and they wanted a proven star attached to it. Lean had seen Christie in Billy Liar, a modest British production, and something in her performance convinced him she was exactly right for the role. He pushed back against studio resistance with characteristic stubbornness, insisting that her particular quality of natural, unforced presence was precisely what Lara required. The studio eventually relented, though not without continued reservations during early production. Christie was in the middle of filming Darling when she was cast, a role that would go on to win her the Academy Award for Best Actress, just as Dr. Zhivago was being released. The timing made her one of the most talked about performers in the world almost overnight. What the studio had seen as a risk turned into one of the most celebrated pieces of casting in 1960s cinema, a reminder that the directors who push hardest for unconventional choices are sometimes the ones who see most clearly. Number 8. Fake riot fooled real authorities. Recreating historical unrest on screen is always a delicate business, but on one occasion during this production, the line between fiction and reality collapsed in a way nobody had planned for. A large-scale protest sequence, staged with hundreds of extras on the Madrid street set, was filmed with such commitment and visual authenticity that it reportedly caused genuine alarm among people who encountered it unexpectedly. Local police, unfamiliar with the scale of the production, reportedly believed at one point that an actual uprising was taking place. Some residents in the surrounding area reportedly interpreted the crowds, banners, and general noise as signs of real civil unrest. The production team had to work quickly to clarify the situation and prevent the scene from escalating beyond the set. The incident speaks to something remarkable about the way the film was made. The commitment to physical large-scale authenticity was so complete that it occasionally spilled beyond its intended boundaries. For David Lean, who was famous for demanding absolute realism in every frame, it was perhaps the ultimate unintended compliment. The protest looked real because enormous effort had been made to ensure it would. That it briefly fooled people outside the production was simply the logical result of doing the job too well. Number 9. The star who refused the lead. Before Omar Sharif was ever considered for the central role, another actor was David Lean's first choice, and his refusal left a significant mark on their professional relationship. Peter O'Toole, who had worked with Lean on Lawrence of Arabia just a few years earlier, was approached to play Yuri Zhivago. He turned it down, a decision that genuinely stung the director. The two had formed a close and productive bond during the grueling production of Lawrence of Arabia, and Lean had hoped to build on that collaboration. O'Toole's reasons for declining were never fully detailed publicly, but the effect on their working relationship was real and lasting. The warmth that had characterized their previous partnership cooled considerably, and the two never worked together again. For the film itself, the consequences were profound, though not in the way Lean might have feared. The casting that followed eventually led to Omar Sharif stepping into a role that suited him in ways that are now difficult to separate from the film's identity. But in the moment, the rejection stung. It was a reminder that even the most successful director-actor partnerships have limits, and that sometimes the best outcomes arrive through doors you never intended to open. Number 10. Warm weather ruined winter plans. A significant portion of the story depends on snow, the frozen landscapes, the ice-covered windows of the Varikino house, the brutal Russian winter that shaped so much of the film's emotional tone. When production moved to locations in Finland and Canada to capture genuine winter conditions, nature simply refused to cooperate. Unusually mild temperatures left landscapes bare when the cameras needed them white. The disruption was costly in every sense. Schedules were reorganized, crew and equipment had to be redeployed, and the budget absorbed delays that nobody had anticipated. Producers watched the calendar anxiously as weeks passed without the cold conditions that had been central to the entire location strategy. The film's most visually distinctive sequences were at risk of never looking the way Lean had imagined them. The weather problem ultimately forced the production into one of its most creative decisions. If nature wouldn't provide snow reliably, the crew would manufacture it. What followed was a remarkable exercise in practical ingenuity that produced some of the most iconic winter imagery in cinema history, despite never actually relying on real snowfall. That story belongs to a later chapter, but it began here, with an unseasonably warm season and a production staring down a very expensive problem. Number 11. A film that revived studios. Few productions in history have had such a direct and measurable impact on the local industry that hosted them. When the decision was made to base the bulk of filming in Spain, the country's film infrastructure was modest by Hollywood standards, but the arrival of this production changed that almost immediately. The sheer scale of what was required forced rapid development of facilities that hadn't previously existed. The production employed thousands of Spanish workers, not just as extras, but as carpenters, painters, engineers, electricians, and craftspeople. Studios that had been underutilized were expanded and modernized to accommodate the demands of a major MGM production. Equipment was brought in, skills were transferred, and local technicians gained experience working alongside some of the most accomplished crews in the industry. The legacy outlasted the shoot itself. Spain's film industry emerged from the experience significantly more capable than it had entered it, with upgraded facilities and a workforce that had been trained to international standards. Productions that followed in subsequent years benefited directly from the infrastructure this film helped build. What had begun as a practical location decision, chosen largely because the Soviet Union was inaccessible, ended up reshaping an entire national industry in ways that nobody had fully predicted when the cameras first arrived. It was an accidental gift that kept giving long after the final scene wrapped. Number 12. Sharif was meant for another role. It's one of the more quietly remarkable casting stories in Hollywood history. The actor who became the face of the film almost didn't take the role that made him famous. Omar Sharif had been following the production's development closely and had expressed genuine interest in playing Pasha, the passionate political figure who becomes one of Zhivago's most significant rivals. That was the character he wanted. The lead was a different matter entirely. When David Lean approached him about playing Yuri Zhivago instead, Sharif was genuinely hesitant. The role was enormous in scope, present in nearly every major sequence, required to carry the film's emotional weight across a 3-hour runtime, and demanding a subtlety of performance that differed significantly from the intensity of Pasha. Sharif wasn't immediately convinced he was the right fit, and his uncertainty was real rather than performative modesty. Lean persisted, and Sharif accepted. The result was a performance that became inseparable from the film's identity, quiet, melancholic, and deeply human in a way that suited the character perfectly. Sharif would later reflect that taking the role changed the entire trajectory of his career. It's worth pausing on how differently things might have unfolded had Lean accepted that initial hesitation and moved on to another candidate. The film we know today was shaped in no small part by one actor being talked out of his first instinct and trusting a director who believed in him more than he believed in himself. Number 13. Winter scenes shot in extreme heat. There's a particular kind of professional discipline required to convincingly shiver on camera when the temperature around you is doing the opposite. For the cast and crew of this production, that challenge was not occasional. It was a sustained feature of the entire shoot. Many of the film's most iconic winter sequences, filled with heavy coats, frozen breath, and characters bracing against bitter cold, were filmed under genuinely warm Spanish skies. The physical toll was significant. Actors dressed in thick wool costumes, fur-lined coats, and layered period clothing spent long shooting days in conditions that made the wardrobe almost unbearable. Heat exhaustion was a real concern, and the crew worked to manage conditions as best they could, but there were limits to what could be done when the costume requirements were non-negotiable. The performance had to look cold, while the body was doing the opposite. What makes this detail so striking is how completely invisible it is on screen. The performances carry total conviction, and the visual design, artificial snow, controlled lighting, carefully chosen angles, supports the illusion without a single crack showing. It stands as one of the more underappreciated technical achievements in the film, a sustained act of collective deception that required not just skill, but genuine physical endurance from everyone involved. The audience never suspected a thing, which is perhaps the finest compliment any illusion can receive. Number 14. Color was used as a secret tool. Not every choice in a David Lean film happens by accident, and the way color moves through this production is one of its most deliberately constructed elements. For long stretches, the palette is dominated by gray, brown, and muted blue, the visual language of cold, exhaustion, and political oppression. These are not simply realistic choices. They are carefully calculated ones, designed to make certain moments hit harder when something different finally appears. The most famous example is the field of daffodils at Vericano, a sudden explosion of yellow that lands with almost physical force after extended periods of visual restraint. Cinematographer Freddie Young worked closely with Lean to ensure these transitions were precisely timed and controlled. Color in this film functions almost like a musical instrument, held back until the moment of release means something. The approach was not universally understood during production, and some involved questioned whether the muted stretches would feel too bleak for mainstream audiences. Lean held firm. The finished film vindicated his instinct completely. The color contrast became one of the most discussed aspects of the production's visual identity, and the daffodil sequence remains among the most visually striking moments in 1960s cinema. It's a masterclass in restraint, built on the simple understanding that beauty needs contrast to reach its full effect. Every dull gray scene was, in a sense, an investment in the moments that followed. Number 15. Thousands of flowers were controlled. Nature is not a cooperative collaborator on a tight production schedule, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the effort required to bring the film's famous flower sequences to life. Hundreds of thousands of daffodil bulbs were planted across large areas of the Spanish countryside in careful coordination with the expected filming timeline. The goal was to have them bloom precisely when the cameras were ready, an ambition that turned out to be considerably more difficult than it sounds. Weather patterns and seasonal variations meant the blooms didn't always arrive on cue. The production team found themselves in the unusual position of actively managing fields of flowers, storing bulbs in controlled conditions, replanting them in stages, and working around the rhythms of natural growth that refused to conform to a shooting schedule. At one point, blooms that had appeared too early had to be carefully managed to ensure they would survive until the cameras arrived. The sequence that resulted from all of this effort lasts only minutes on screen, but it carries an emotional weight that far exceeds its runtime. Few viewers watching that field of yellow filling the frame would guess that the image required months of agricultural coordination, careful logistics, and no small amount of anxiety to produce. It's a perfect example of the hidden labor that underlies even the most beautiful and apparently effortless moments in filmmaking. A reminder that in cinema, even nature itself sometimes needs a little help hitting its mark. Number 16. The train journey was built. Railway sequences have always carried a special kind of cinematic weight, movement, confinement, and passing landscapes, creating a natural, dramatic tension. In this film, the extended train journey east is one of the most visually and emotionally significant sections of the story. What viewers don't see is what it took to put those images on screen. The railway infrastructure required for those sequences didn't simply exist waiting to be used. Much of it had to be built or substantially modified from scratch. Production teams scouted and worked across multiple locations to assemble what would appear on screen as a single, continuous journey. Tracks were extended, terrain was reshaped, and the visual continuity of the sequence was carefully constructed in the editing room from footage gathered at entirely separate sites. The locomotive and carriages used in filming were period accurate in appearance, requiring significant work to source and prepare for camera. The effort behind those sequences reflects a broader philosophy that ran through the entire production. Nothing was left to chance if it could be controlled, and no shortcut was acceptable if the result would be visible on screen. The train journey feels seamless and immersive because enormous resources were spent ensuring it would. It's the kind of filmmaking achievement that becomes invisible precisely because it succeeded. leaving audiences simply to feel the weight of the journey rather than question how it was captured. That invisibility was always the entire point, and on that measure, the production delivered completely. Number 17. A cameraman was replaced midway. Behind-the-scenes changes in key creative roles rarely stay secret for long, but the details of what happened with this film's cinematography have remained surprisingly understated over the decades. The production began with Nicholas Roeg behind the camera, a talented and ambitious cinematographer who would later become a celebrated director in his own right. His departure, partway through filming, was the result of creative tensions that had been building for some time. The precise nature of the disagreements between Roeg and David Lean has been described in various ways by different sources, but the core issue appears to have been a fundamental difference in visual approach. Lean was precise, controlled, and absolute in his vision. Roeg had strong instincts of his own. On a production of this scale and complexity, that kind of friction was always going to resolve in one direction, and it did when Freddie Young took over the cinematography role. Young had previously collaborated with Lean on Lawrence of Arabia, and the working relationship between the two was well established and deeply complementary. The transition, while disruptive in the short term, ultimately produced a visual consistency that suited the film's grand ambitions. Young would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Cinematography for his work on the film, a considerable outcome for a role he stepped into midway through production. The question of what Roeg's version might have looked like remains one of the production's more intriguing unanswered questions. A parallel film that exists only in imagination, shaped by a collaboration that simply wasn't meant to last. Number 18. Snow was made from marble dust. The problem had been established earlier in the production. Real winter conditions had refused to cooperate, leaving the crew with a fundamental challenge. A story set largely in the frozen Russian wilderness needed to look genuinely cold, and the locations available weren't delivering the natural snowfall required. The solution that emerged was as inventive as it was unexpected, and it produced some of the most enduring visual imagery in the entire film. Marble dust was identified as the ideal material for large-scale artificial snow. It had the right texture and reflective quality to photograph convincingly under studio and location lighting, holding its appearance across long shooting days in ways that other materials couldn't match. Vast quantities were sourced and deployed, covering outdoor sets, dressing interior scenes, and creating the layered, weathered look of accumulated snowfall rather than a simple surface dusting. The frozen windows of the Varikino house, one of the film's most iconic visual signatures, were created using a combination of wax and other applied materials rather than actual ice. Every element of the winter aesthetic was manufactured, layered, and carefully lit to produce an impression of cold that audiences around the world accepted entirely without question. The irony is complete. Some of the most convincingly frozen images in cinema history were created in warm conditions using materials that had never seen a winter at all. It was industrial ingenuity dressed as poetry, and nobody in the audience noticed the difference. Number 19. The red dress nearly didn't happen. Visual storytelling in cinema often depends on details that seem simple from the outside, but involve considerable negotiation to reach. The red dress worn by Julie Christie in one of the film's key sequences is exactly that kind of detail. A moment of deliberate visual contrast that has stayed in the memory of audiences for decades. What's less known is that it almost didn't make it to the screen in the form audiences eventually saw. Christie had strong instincts about her character and was not someone who accepted costume or staging decisions without understanding their purpose. Her hesitation about the red dress came from a need to understand the dramatic justification. She wanted the choice to mean something specific for Lara, not simply to serve as a visual device. Those conversations with the director and costume department were detailed and, at times, genuinely uncertain in outcome. The resolution came through a more thorough discussion of what the moment represented in Lara's arc, the color functioning as a signal of something defiant and alive within a world that was relentlessly draining both qualities away. Once that connection was made clearly, Christie's commitment to the scene was total. The resulting image became one of the film's most reproduced and discussed visual moments. It's a small reminder that the best on-screen details are sometimes the ones that were most seriously questioned before they were allowed to exist, and that an actor's resistance, when rooted in genuine understanding of character, can make the final result significantly stronger. Number 20. Falling petals replaced tears. David Lean had a consistent and deeply held belief that the camera should show rather than explain, that a well-constructed image could carry emotional weight that dialogue or conventional performance might actually diminish. This philosophy produced some of the most quietly powerful moments in his work, and one of the most striking examples appears in this film in a scene where grief is communicated not through an actor's face, but through something falling. Rather than staging a conventional emotional performance for a moment of significant loss, Lean chose to let falling petals carry the scene's weight. The visual substitution was deliberate. Petals drifting downward in silence, their movement doing the work that tears might have done in a less considered production. The choice divided some opinions during filming, with questions raised about whether audiences would make the connection without more explicit emotional signposting. They did. The scene is consistently cited by viewers and critics as one of the most affecting in the entire film, precisely because it trusts the audience to feel, rather than being directed to feel. Lean's instinct that restraint is often more powerful than expression was vindicated completely. It's the kind of decision that looks obvious in retrospect, but requires genuine conviction to defend during production when everyone around you is asking for something more straightforward. Sometimes the most daring choice is the one that does the least, and in this case, doing less created a moment that has outlasted almost everything around it. Number 21. A real reaction made the cut. The most carefully controlled productions occasionally produce their most memorable moments by accident. For all of David Lean's meticulous planning and his reputation for leaving nothing to chance, one of the film's most quietly affecting moments came from something that wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't part of any shooting plan. It survived into the final cut precisely because Lean recognized what he had captured before anyone could suggest otherwise. The unscripted moment occurred during a scene involving Omar Sharif, when a genuine emotional reaction surfaced in a way that differed from what the script had outlined. Rather than calling for another take to bring the performance back in line with the written intention, Lean made the immediate decision to keep it. His instinct was that authentic human response, the kind that can't be manufactured on demand, was worth more than technical compliance with a page of dialogue. The decision reflects something important about how the greatest directors work. Precision and planning are essential tools, but knowing when to set them aside is an entirely different skill, one that requires both confidence and a certain willingness to be surprised. The moment in question blends so seamlessly into the surrounding material that most viewers have no idea they're watching something unplanned. That invisibility is its own kind of achievement. What began as a departure from the script became, in the finished film, exactly what the scene needed. Proof that even the most controlled productions leave room for something real to break through. Number 22. Every shot was carefully planned. There is a version of filmmaking that embraces spontaneity as a creative principle, and then there is the way David Lean worked. On every production he led, Lean arrived with an almost architectural level of preparation. Shots were conceived, drawn, and refined long before cast and crew assembled on set. For a film of this scale, spanning multiple countries, dozens of major sequences, and a cast of thousands, that preparation wasn't just a personal preference, it was a structural necessity. Lean worked closely with his production designer and director of photography during the pre-production period to map the visual language of the entire film in advance. Individual shots were planned with specific emotional and compositional intentions attached to each. The famous widescreen vistas, the intimate two-person scenes, the crowd sequences, all of them were conceived as part of a unified visual architecture, rather than assembled instinctively on the day. This level of control created friction with some collaborators, as earlier chapters have touched on, but it also produced a film of extraordinary visual coherence. Every frame feels considered because every frame was considered, often weeks or months before the camera rolled. Crew members who worked with Lean consistently described the experience as unlike any other production they had been part of, demanding and at times overwhelming, but guided by a clarity of vision that left no room for doubt about where the film was headed. The results speak for themselves in every frame, and the scale of the preparation behind them is a story in its own right, as remarkable as anything visible on screen. Number 23. 30+ hours cut into one film. The finished film runs to approximately 3 hours and 17 minutes, itself a considerable length by any standard. What that runtime obscures is the sheer volume of material that was gathered during production and then systematically reduced to reach it. The original footage shot across the full production period amounted to well over 30 hours of raw material, representing one of the largest ratios of film to finished content in major Hollywood history up to that point. Editor Norman Savage faced a task that was genuinely daunting in its scale. The assembly cut alone ran to a length that was entirely unreleasable, multiple times longer than any version a commercial audience could sit through. Reducing that material required not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of the story's emotional architecture. Entire subplots were trimmed or removed. Sequences that had taken days to film disappeared entirely. Characters who had substantial screen time in early cuts were reduced to brief appearances. The editing process took months, and the decisions made during it shaped the film's identity as profoundly as any choice made on set. What survived into the final cut did so because it was irreplaceable. every remaining scene had to justify its presence against the weight of everything that had been removed. The discipline required to reduce 30+ hours to 3 is a form of storytelling in itself, and the coherence of the finished film is evidence of how well that discipline was applied. Audiences experienced the poetry, the editors lived through the arithmetic, and somewhere in those discarded hours lies a version of the film the world will never see. Number 24. Cannes rejected its identity. Film festivals are supposed to be celebrations of cinema, spaces where national boundaries dissolve in shared appreciation of the art form. The reception this film encountered in certain corners of the international festival circuit was a reminder that politics rarely fully leaves the room, no matter how grand the occasion. The tension that had surrounded the source novel since its publication found a new stage when the film entered the world of international exhibition. Soviet representatives and sympathizers at Cannes objected to the film's portrayal of the revolutionary period and its implicit sympathy for characters caught on the wrong side of history. The objections went beyond critical disagreement. There were organized efforts to question the film's legitimacy as a representation of Russian culture and history, with some voices arguing that it had no right to tell the story it was telling. The political charge that the CIA had recognized in the novel years earlier had transferred entirely to its cinematic adaptation. The controversy was ultimately unable to diminish the film's commercial and critical trajectory. It went on to become one of the highest-grossing releases of its era and won 5 Academy Awards. But the festival tension served as a pointed reminder that the story of Dr. Zhivago could not be separated from its political context, no matter how many years passed or how many borders it crossed. A film that had been born in controversy was fated to carry that weight wherever it traveled, and in some rooms it still does. Decades later, the arguments it provoked feel less like film criticism and more like an extension of the history it depicted. Number 25. A theme song took over the world. Some film scores exist to support the images they accompany. Others escape the cinema entirely and take on a life of their own. The music composed by Maurice Jarre for this film did something rarer still. It became one of the most recognized and widely performed pieces of music of the entire 20th century, heard in contexts that had nothing to do with the film that had originally inspired it. The central theme, built around the balalaika and instantly associated with Lara's character, was not universally embraced during production. Lean pushed hard for Jarre's composition after the original choice of composer fell through, and the rushed timeline under which the score was created added considerable pressure. The balalaika instrumentation was a deliberate choice to evoke Russian feeling without relying on authentic folk material, a carefully constructed impression rather than a direct borrowing. What followed the film's release was extraordinary. The theme was recorded by orchestras, jazz ensembles, and solo performers across dozens of countries. It appeared in advertisements, television programs, and live concert repertoires completely detached from its cinematic origin. Jarre won the Academy Award for Best Original Score, but the music's legacy extended far beyond any award. Decades after the film's release, the melody remains immediately recognizable to millions of people who may never have seen a single frame of the production it came from. In the end, the music became something the film itself could never fully contain, a piece of the 20th century that simply refused to stay on screen. It is perhaps the most lasting proof that truly great filmmaking leaves marks that no ending credits can contain. What began as a banned novel, caught between superpowers and surrounded by danger, became one of the most ambitious and visually extraordinary films ever made. Every secret uncovered in these chapters points to the same truth, that the beauty audiences have admired for 6 decades was built on a foundation of extraordinary effort, creative courage, and an almost stubborn refusal to accept anything less than the impossible. David Lean didn't just make a film about survival against overwhelming forces. He lived that story during the making of it, battling weather, politics, creative conflict, and the sheer logistical weight of recreating a world that no longer existed. The cast and crew who accompanied him through that process produced something that has outlasted every obstacle placed in front of it. That they succeeded at all, given everything working against them, may be the greatest secret of all. If these hidden stories gave you a deeper appreciation for what's on screen every time you watch Dr. Zhivago, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss another journey behind the films that shaped cinema. And let us know in the comments, which of these 25 secrets surprised you the most?